Hey, fellow Geonteers, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. In this third episode of our four-part series, we continue our discussion with the jovial, enlightening tantric teacher Glenn H. Mullin, or simply Lama Glenn to his students. The long version of his bio is in the intro to the first episode, but even the short version is still pretty long, so here goes. Lama Glenn traveled to the Indian Himalayas in the early 70s, where he first met the Dalai Lama. He stayed on as a student for 12 years, studying with 35 of the greatest living masters of the Tibetan tradition. Drawing on those experiences, he has authored over 30 books and become an international teacher of Tantric Buddhism. Lama Glenn has also been an avid advocate for Buddhist art, curating important art exhibitions and advocating for contemporary artists of the East in the West. He is currently at work on a book on Nicholas Roerich, the great Russian painter, spiritual thinker, and social activist. Lama Glenn is also the special advisor to the Roerich House Museum and Institute in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, which I personally helped create by making a very modest donation of support. But every little bit helps, right? Which is just a way of bringing up the philanthropic aspect of Lama Glenn's work, supporting meaningful spiritual, creative, and humanitarian causes. So if you have the resources and never want to support some noble causes, Lama Glenn is a good and reliable conduit for that kind of generosity. Finally, he is also an expert in travel to the sacred sites of the Himalayas. He leads tours and acts as a consultant to those wanting to travel safely and meaningfully through those sacred sites. Okay, in this episode, Lama Glenn serves up a full-on, overflowing, and spiritually intoxicating cocktail glass of gin and Tantra. He was really on a roll. Actually, as someone who has known him for a decently long time, this is really one of my favorites of his unique presentations of Tantric Thought and Practice. He talks about how to seek a personally, tantrically meaningful and joyful life in a world too often run by thugs and buffoons, and outlines the Buddhist practices that help one do that, including creatively seeing the world as joyful, divine, and interconnected, and overcoming what Einstein called optical delusion. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to Gin and Tantra, spirituality with a twist. The podcast that takes Tantrism, Buddhism, Taoism, Sufism, Kabbalism, Shamanism, Chinese medicinism, and all of the other isms we've been influenced by, and blends them into a tall, crisp, cool cocktail your spirit has been longing for.
I want you to get together.
Now, isn't that refreshing?
I want you to get together.
You know, and I mean, it is kind of a random speculation on my part, but I think in the West, our economic systems are completely obsolete. They're all based on sort of colonial capitalist rape and pillage the earth policies. Needs a total restructure of the economy. Our way of spending our daily time, what is meaningful activity and meaningful pursuits, has to be revised. Our approach to medicine, health, well-being has to be revised. Our approach to family, child rearing has to be revised. And if we can get those 4 or 5 things done. Also, I would like to see one environmental tradition brought in from Genghis Khan. With Genghis Khan, he made the rule that if anyone pollutes earth, water, fire, or air, there's no redemption. It's a death sentence. So I think that would be a very, very good solution to our present environmental crisis.
We could probably in the United States use some steep fines just to get the ball rolling.
No.
Go all the way to
Then the rich will still abuse it. We have those fines now under the EPA in the States. I mean, that's one reason why some people hate the EPA, is because all you have to do is give the EPA $25,000 a year in a fine, and it's kind of a license to dump toxic chemicals wherever you want and save yourself $500 million. You know, I think Genghis Khan had the right policy. It should be the death sentence.
I am really fascinated by what you're saying, though, Lama Glenn, because I've been thinking about that a lot too. Those 5 or 6 things you mentioned, I mean, when you really look at it honestly, that's where the whole culture kind of just went, right? And I
Yeah,
think,
it's sort of comes out of, I think, a combination of colonialism linked to the Industrial Revolution, linked to this pre-Semitic religions, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, that God created the world for us to enjoy. Now, if you look at those 3 teachings in a deeper way, you could say, made us caretakers of the world. But people don't take it that way. They take it like, that oil under the earth is mine, I can frack it, or that sacred mountain has gold, I can blow it up and use harmful chemicals that poison the rivers for the next 1,000 miles. It's amazing that outside Chicago, fish caught in the Lake Superior, the first of the lakes, is often too toxic for the fish to be eaten. And if you go downstream, by the time you get to Toronto, just if you fall in the lake, which I did one time, because a boat came in, a ferry boat came in from Toronto on Toronto Island, and a little kid fell in right in front of the boat when it was there, when the boat was 10 feet away. And luckily I was standing right there. So I dived in and grabbed the kid and hung on, because those propellers spin like that, right? The kid would have been chopped up to hamburger. But we both need to get shots. Because
dodge the one thing, now you have to deal with the other thing, right? Yeah.
The lake is so polluted that even like falling in it requires a shot.
So the thing, Daniel and I are doing this little podcast venture we're a part of now. Those things that you're mentioning, we sort of look at. I don't know how you feel about this, Daniel, but for me, it is kind of like we recognize that those are the problems where the culture's kind of gone awry, and in a part, we're trying to reach out to other people who are just trying to find their way within this space, and having people like you on to share your wisdom about how to do that. But yeah, I think that's the recognition. I think that's even the whole motivation in doing this. Just that the idea, like, yeah, something has gone awry. It's affecting on a macro level, but on the micro level, you still have to try to find your personal way within this. It's like not an easy situation. And I guess that's the motivation for us even doing this.
Yeah, I mean, all of us alive today, I mean, the amount of public attention on the desperateness of the planetary situation is not a secret or an esoteric scientific fact known only by a few elite educated intellectuals. The environmental situation is well known to everyone. The danger of the military situation with, probably 20 countries having nuclear bombs, and some of those countries having dozens of nuclear bombs. And, the state of the economical situation with, America, what is it, 1 or 2% of the people being very, very, very wealthy, and 20 or 30 million people living well below the poverty line. In China, of course, it's the same. And Europe's gotten around a little bit that way by sort of having a little bit of a welfare society, but that's really a patchwork on the situation. It's not a solution to the situation, just giving handouts to those for whom the social structure has placed them in a desperate situation. A handout is a temporary solution, not a long-term solution. And the other biggest problem we have as humans, I think, is finding a meaningful life or meaning in life. And there's a lot of interesting psychological research done on this, medical research done on it, quite a bit of literature out there on it. But the key to happiness often is not how much you have or what your living situation is, or even if your, wife and kids are that well behaved. It's really your own sense of the meaningfulness of your days and nights, of the meaningfulness of your life, a sense of purpose, a sense of value, something like that. And I think in the Western world, that's become very, very serious because we used to have not really so much of a link to what we are doing as being fulfilling, because the Industrial Revolution brought in this kind of educational system where people are basically, school is basically a polytech to produce workers or executives inside the industrial complex and a big international financial complex. It's basically a career training device. And the problem there is we really see what we do as a way to pay our bills.
Yeah.
That isn't very meaningful for people. If you don't have meaning beyond that, I mean, of course, it is important to pay your bills. I'm not to say that not having meaning isn't important, but there's no sense of the fulfillment of life, the rigors of life, the demands of life, the blood, sweat, and tears that life entails, with all the kinds of ups and downs that come with every year, from house fires and tornadoes and earthquakes and friends dying, wife and kids getting cancer and dying, and all these kind of things. If paying the bills were enough, then that would be wonderful. But as we notice, as studies show, it's really not enough. But a sense of a deeper meaning in life and a way of processing the vicissitudes is really something that has to be explored. One reason I love Nicholas Roerich, and as you know, I'm presently in retreat doing a book on Nicholas Roerich.
Yeah, maybe you could tell a little bit about that project and who Roerich is. Yeah.
One reason I love him very much is I love him as an artist, of course. He's one of the great artists of the early part of the last century. But as a social thinker, he came up with this idea after World War I that until now, the planet has largely been run by thugs and buffoons.
Yeah.
And he managed to convince a few billionaires in New York that this was the case, and had one of them build something called the Masters Institute in New York City, which would try to get the genius social scientists, political scientists, engineers, financial wizards, and so on, get them all in one building, designing a kind of a new world order, which would actually work. Because until now, it's sort of been, buffoon versus buffoon. If you look at World War I, it's a perfect example of that. You look at the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, a perfect example. Look at the way colonialism raped and pillaged country after country, burning down libraries in South America, like the Mayan Indians, all of their culture being destroyed, all of their vast scientific and social literature all being destroyed before anyone had even read it. Outside of most of those Mayans thereafter sort of not really allowed to pursue their traditional training for education. So having buffoons and thieves and brigands and thugs run things is not really the best way to go. And that's really what we've had in the West, really for the last 400 or 500 years, I think. And, we've brought us to this near extinction of our planet, as people like Al Gore and the such like to comment from repeatedly. And it's quite true that we are near extinction on many, many fronts because of being led and guided by buffoons. This is a political season in the States, so one doesn't like to accuse anyone of being more of a buffoon than anyone else.
That's enough. There's enough of that label to go around. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big enough label that anyone involved in that whole situation. So anyway, I like Nicholas Roerich's idea of getting the geniuses of the world together to kind of think things through. Of course, it didn't work out because, Stalin came up in Russia and Hitler came up in Germany, and America got into a tuffle with Japan, and that led to America and everyone getting into a tuffle with Europe, a European tuffle. And sort of the whole thing just fell apart, and hopes of it going. So it was. We could say it was like a preterm birth. What do you call it? If a child comes out
Yeah. It was
a miscarriage, it became a miscarriage.
Yeah.
It died before it was born.
Yeah.
It only existed for 10 or 12 years, but Einstein signed on to it, and
Oh,
many of the great thinkers of the world signed on to it.
I didn't know there was an Einstein connection to this. It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is actually kind of a deep thing. Obviously, like, not in our show notes, but like you went, like, going to this place is very good because I think it's something that people really feel. And if I talk about it very personally, my own personal experience with this was like, I don't know, I can do anything about this macro level. Maybe some Roerich person could do something, but I don't know if I can do anything about this. And maybe growing up in America, you get a little bit despondent because you feel like, well, the macro level is out of control. We don't know what we can do. So all of a sudden you sort of focus on the micro level of the individual people around you, and yourself. And maybe that's the way you can make a contribution to the world. How do you think about that with your students, Lama Glenn? I mean, there's this huge overwhelming problems, and then there's also the problem of each person trying to develop themselves. How do you think about that?
I think with a teacher of Mahayana Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism, I am a strong adherent to the idea that the individual motivation is extremely important. And if every person does their best for their own enlightenment, on the one hand, and secondly, to be kind and gracious to all other beings. When we say all other living beings, it doesn't mean all other humans. It means trees and grass and rivers and clouds. We say Tintin Tempe Kelkor in Tibetan, the supporting and supported mandalas, or the supported and supported sources of joy, something like that. And I think that's the best place to start, is by trying to become a universal heroine, or a bodhisattva, that from one's own side, to try to cultivate one's own inner calmness, inner, as they say, ethics, meditation, and wisdom of examining one's inner life, nature of self, one's inner life. Those three as the foundation, and the 6 paramitas on the basis of that, as they're called, to be generous with all living beings, and to be ethical with all living beings, to be patient and forgiving with all living beings, be only joyful with others regardless of what kind of rectum apertures they are, to always bring joy to one's every activity, and to cultivate daily quiet and contemplation. Because without that, one just becomes all tied up in knots inside. It becomes part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And finally, to develop the 3 kinds of wisdom, so sort of a sense of the infinity or vastness of being, and at the same time, the kind of specific precision of the finite aspect of the moment. And thirdly, how always to express oneself with others in a way that is beneficial and meaningful. So I think beginning with oneself in that way, and it doesn't matter if you're a Buddhist or some other tradition. Of course, being a Buddhist, I think Buddhism has some advantages that others don't. Like right now, Gaspé, where I am, I grew up Church of England, which I guess in America, that's the Episcopalian church. We weren't allowed to call it the Church of England anymore down there. The Episcopalian. But, I think there is, in the Christian or the Jewish tradition, the idea of God made the earth in 6 days and then took a rest. I think we have to think, if he did take a rest, it was either a bad idea because the project wasn't very well finished yet, or he took the rest on the 6th day, leaving a little bit for us to take care of ourselves. So I think as a Buddhist, sort of ethics, meditation, and cultivation of wisdom of one's own inner functioning is very, very important. And the 6 paramitas. And of those 6, I think inner joy is the most important in terms of benefiting others, at least, and feeling good about yourself. In other words, noticing that joy is a switch you control. It's not a response to a pleasant stimuli. It's an inner switch that you can keep turned on. And I think if people do that, everyone is going a little bit in the right direction. And not that everyone has to be any religious or irreligious person. As Dalai Lama often likes to say, my religion is compassion. And compassion's okay, but like Chogyam Trungpa says, you have to be careful it doesn't become idiot compassion, which is why the bigger Buddhist context of the 3 trainings and the 6 paramitas are important kind of backgrounds to that statement by the Dalai Lama.
Well, that's what I've sort of noticed about your teachings, Lama Glenn. Things that jump out at me always are, on the one hand, the joyfulness of it, which I think comes through in a conversation like this. You're presenting a joyful spirituality, and I think sometimes people don't see that. Daniel and I have talked about it a lot. They don't see the spiritual life as being necessarily a joyful thing, but to learn about yourself, to change yourself, to transform yourself, to grow and develop is one of the biggest joys you're going to experience. And the fact that that can also affect other people is a joy. And then I think you also, people use the word emptiness, shunyata, and what always strikes me when you talk about that is the interconnectivity aspect of it too, that things are entwined. And so change one thing and other things change too. Change yourself, other things change.
Yeah, I mean, a problem with translation of, any tradition from one language into another language is those words in one language will not have the full meaning of words in the other language. But, often when we look at these things, what is said in one tradition has many layers of meaning. So with Guhya Samaja Tantra, it said every word in Guhya Samaja Tantra has 6 levels of interpretation. And I think, a problem is people can become the spiritual tradition in the Western world, traditional spirituality, European spirituality, tended to be rather joyless, I would say.
Yeah.
Eve and the sexual issues with this, fig leaves and a snake and an apple or something like that all gets a little bit confusing. And somehow sex comes out as kind of something a little bit got us kicked out of paradise. Was it worth it? Wow. I mean, sex is nice, but paradise? So, there's kind of there's a whole tradition in the early period of Christianity in Europe. Laughter is the voice of the devil and stuff like that. So, I think, as you know, Eric, I mostly teach Tantric Buddhism as kind of the pinnacle of Buddhist tradition. And the idea that every experience we should regard ourselves as a playful tantric deity. And whatever occurs to us, we should, from other outside beings, we should embrace it with a kind of a playful, joyous quality, a theatrical quality, and not rely upon the ordinary appearance of things. Because always everything has many levels. And, if you're married, for instance, you see this very clearly, right? Your wife is in a bad situation in her life, her sister's sick or something's happening, she's in a bad mood. And so the food doesn't taste that good. Now, you'd never know it from eating the food that the situation was linked to her worrying about her wife. And so she got the meal wrong, or, you're the cook and you got it wrong. Your wife eating it wouldn't have noticed that, it's because, your brother was hit by a car or blah, 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 or, something like that. So there's always many aspects to every experience, and culture versus nurture and all this kind of stuff. But both of those are at play in every situation. I think the tantric idea of never accepting anything at face value and always trying to embrace everything in a joyful, playful way. I was just watching a comedian on this the other day, taking Mel Brooks' Mel Brooks' sort of take on comedy as
Oh, yeah.
the best way to embrace tragedy. And many of the best comedy pieces, comedians come out of sort of tragic circumstances, and their comedy often deals to some extent with tragedy. And then I think that's really what this tantric teaching on see yourself as a playful tantric deity, whatever occurs to you, is part of some sort of enlightenment celebratory drama, regardless of what it is. Now, yea, though we walk through the valley of death, we fear no evil. We are walking through a valley of death, as Jim Morrison of The Doors puts it. But nobody gets out alive. So, we're surrounded by death, we're surrounded by disease, we're surrounded by tragedy. But amidst all of that, there's also great joy, and there's, babies born and flowers blooming and beautiful sunshine and many, many wonderful things. So it's easy to look at the harshness and take that as something very, very significant, and then overlook the joy. Or look at the joyful things and take that as the quality, but then you're overlooking the tragic side. So how to embrace both the beautiful and the horrid in a meaningful, joyful way. So I think that's the challenge of every human being in their life. And I think every spiritual tradition discusses this to some extent. In my Christian tradition I was brought up in, it's like, well, the ways of God are mysterious and eventually you'll find out. I mean, that's kind of okay, but I do prefer the tantric teaching on the 3 training, 6 paramita, and the playful deity yoga.
So on the deity yoga, about that set of ideas, because I think a couple of things you said that really struck me for people who would be listening to this would be, on the one hand, there's this idea of bringing the locus of joy more internal. So even if the external circumstances can go, and they're going to be at some point or another like that, there's this learning that you can still bring that joyful thing up inside of you, through your own training and experience. And then there's that idea that you see yourself as sort of a divine being. In Buddhism, you'd see yourself as, one of the images of enlightenment. Some of the people who would be listening to this don't have that specific initiations and training in that. But is there a way you can advise people to do that who are just listening, who maybe don't have specifically tantric Buddhist teachers teaching them that? But
well, I do think that Einstein got a lot of his kind of relativity ideas from the Buddhist tradition, because of course he grew up speaking the German language. And Buddhism, the first continental European Buddhist tradition was really, school of study was really the German, Russian a little bit earlier, but in the Western Europe, then the German. And he brings a lot of very interesting terms into his discussion of things that are inspired by Buddhist terms, as you can tell, kind of from the German. So he speaks about optical delusion. And that's a very wonderful word, I think. When we talk about how we experience things, it is an optical delusion. We experience things completely as though everything we're experiencing is separate from us. But at the same time, we're just experiencing it as an inner phenomena. We're not experiencing the outer phenomena. We're just, all we have is the inner phenomena. We only can access the outer phenomena through the inner phenomena. Yeah. In other words, the inner phenomena, when I look at a mountain, I'm not seeing the mountain. I'm seeing the way the mountain is processed by my perceptual and conceptual apparatus. And so I think it's a very wonderful word he used, optical delusion. And then he says, this gives us the sense that wherever we are, whatever we are most close to is more important. So the mountain next to me is more important than the mountain 10 miles away. Person next to me is more important than the person 3 blocks down the street, and so on. But as he points out again, this is completely an optical delusion. The finest particle of matter is connected with all other things. Everything is interconnected. So we have to step beyond that, what Einstein calls optical delusion, and notice the interconnectedness of all things. And when we notice that interconnectedness of all things, then of course that takes us to the other side of that discussion in Nagarjuna, or the Indian word shunya, or emptiness, the infinity of things. The interconnected of all things, the other side of interconnectedness of all things is the infinity of all things. And so I think whether or not, as Dalai Lama often puts it, whether or not you're an adherent of a particular tradition, or whether you just learn some techniques for self-observation and philosophical, spiritual cultivation, isn't so important. The important thing is that we point the mind toward actual reality. Like the word dharma, which often is translated as religion in English, literally means that which is, Rangingo Zimba, that which demonstrates a particular nature, something which can be apprehended as having a particular nature. In other words, a kind of a reality factor, you could say. So we're all dealing with the same reality, and we may use different words for it, and some traditions might have a more sophisticated language for it, and others might have a more sophisticated sort of spiritual approach to it, and so on. And these are one aspect of things, but the other aspect is we all have the same reality. As Dalai Lama puts it, every human has one nose, 2 ears, 2 eyes, 1 mouth, and I would add an asshole.
Yeah.
As they say in the medical literature, 9 apertures.
Yeah, the Chinese, 9 openings in the body, only 7 are up here. Actually, if you're a woman, 10, just to acknowledge it, right? Yeah. So I think in the what was amazing to me going into the Tibetan Tantric Buddhist world was they have all of these kind of interesting, like, I guess you'd say, techniques, to help you accomplish this. And so one of them that you brought up was this idea of kind of revisualizing your environment. And I think when I first heard that, I was like, what are they asking me to do exactly? But you realize that there's something really powerful about that. If you're, if you have your significant other and all of a sudden they're being a pain in the ass and you see them as Tara, that just feels different.
A problem we have with everything with humans is that humans are creatures of habit. Like, for instance, people smoke and they might think smoking is bad for them, but then they've been smoking, and so the natural momentum is to smoke, and to change that momentum is a problem. Now, for instance, we know that certain kind of industries are terrible for the environment and terrible for people's working in them and so on. But our whole, say, economic system has its own kind of momentum, right? And if we close down that industry, you put 5 million people out of jobs. And then that's a whole process of momentum. That momentum of those 5 million people has to be redirected and retuned. It's not a small thing. And everything in our life, everything is momentum. I look at a friend as a friend, and the momentum is there to see him with friendly eyes. And I'll look at someone who's been difficult to me with, suspicious eyes or cautious eyes, and that momentum is there. And it's the same thing with all phenomena. We experience them on a kind of predispositioned display, you could say. When we smell coffee, we think, good. But, the first time coffee was introduced, people smelled it and, what's that stink?
Yeah.
Like the other day, my niece gave me some moose meat because my great nephew killed a moose. The moose hunting season had just opened, and I cooked it. and the whole house smelled like moose for like 24 hours.
Gamey.
So, this whole kind of momentum thing is there. Once the aroma is in the house, getting it out, or if someone smokes in their house, getting this aroma of the smokehouse is not easy. So I think when we see our body as the body of a deity, in other words, this body is pure wisdom, pure light. It's not just meat, flesh, blood, bone, shit, piss, and so on. It's really just a kind of field of energy. It's just E equals mc squared. Every molecule, every atom is E equals mc squared. And the world around us appears like, yeah, that's like an ugly house, or that's an ugly person, or that's an ugly dog, or that's an ugly street, and so on. Really, again, it's just E equals mc squared. It's just pure energy bound and manifest in a particular way. But when we look at it with a sort of a way of looking, influence very much. And so it's a little bit like that with everything we see. It is what we make it. More, as expression in English goes, beauty is in the eye of the perceiver. And the point of seeing the world as this sort of emanation of wisdom, emanation of mandala, you could say it's a little bit like an early movement that came into the European Christianity coming over from India, where the whole sort of becomes not really pantheistic, but kind of where the whole world is a manifest of godliness, God energy or something like that. Every tree, every rock, every... if we look, so in the Buddhist world, when we look at this thing, isn't just what it appears to be, but it is a kind of a pure energy, unsullied from the beginning, appearing in a particular way because of my relationship with it. So if I change my sense of self, I change my sense of relationship with it.
I want you to get together. I want you to get put your hands together one time. I want you to get together. I want you to get together.